All right, are we ready? Well, let us begin reading together Brothers and Warriors, Book 1, and the Patriots of the American Revolution series. You'll pardon me the use of my spectacles, but my eyes do not work as well as they once did. And we begin Part 1, The Perishing of Peace. Chapter 1, Wars and Rumors of Wars. Sunday was John's favorite day. No plowing, no hoeing, no fencing, no work, period. It was the only day of the week that he, his older brother James, and younger brother William could do what they wanted to do, with just a few exceptions. On this particular Sunday morning, John packed a load of shot into his papa's Pennsylvania Fowler and headed out squirrel hunting. He had a couple of hours to enjoy all to himself before church. He knew that he could have 4 or 5 of the critters felled and cleaned before the beginning of service. Of course, there remained a few chores that could not be avoided. The milk cows, Sylvia and Barthenia, had to be relieved of their swollen burdens like on any other ordinary day. Water had to be hauled up from the spring. All the livestock had to be fed. He and William had started on all those daily chores right after sunup, and there was, of course, absolutely no getting out of the Sunday church meeting. The Hamilton boys were fine Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, just like their papa. Plus, they would never disappoint their mother by not making their weekly appearance at the meeting house. John decided to fix a quick breakfast before heading out to the woods. The oldest brother of the clan, James, had already fried up a generous plate full of middling meat, while the younger John and William had been taking care of the livestock. The tasty pork grease still lay warm and fragrant in the deep cast iron skillet that was perched on top of the tiny oak wood table beside their hearth. James had eaten his fill of the smoky meat, along with some dried apples and hot tea. James loved his tea, sweetened with copious amounts of honey. Neither John nor William had really ever developed a taste for it. John elected to fry up some hot corn cakes to go with his meat. He pulled a pile of glowing hot coals out of the fireplace onto the hearth and placed the rack and skillet over them to heat up the grease. He then measured out a generous heap of cornmeal into a wooden mixing bowl. He carefully poured a few ounces of the fresh, frothy, warm cow's milk into the cornmeal to reach just the right thickness, and then mixed up a simple batter. He tossed in a hearty pinch of black pepper. Once the grease was sizzling and popping, he carefully poured small puddles of the thick mixture, spacing perfectly round corn cakes in the yellow grease. The skillet hissed as the moisture of the milk rapidly boiled out and released steam into the chilly room. As soon as the bubbles began to appear on top of the puddles, he flipped them over, exposing their golden brown undersides to the air. Within a matter of minutes, he had a hickory platter filled with some 20 of the crunchy treats. Young William walked in just as he was finishing, smiling at the sight of hot corn cakes for breakfast. Slapping 5 of them onto his plate, he grabbed a handful of the middling meat and a jug of sorghum and sat down at the table. John grabbed his own plate and loaded it up. They ate ravenously with both hands, alternately dipping their greasy corn cakes into the sweet, syrupy sorghum and then popping chunks of smoky middling meat into their mouths. Both boys washed their breakfast down with rich, fresh milk. "I gotta mend my white breeches. Mama would just die if I showed up with them torn wide open like they are now. I gotta clean this house too. You and James make a frightful mess when you cook." You don't much seem to mind eating," John shot back. "I ain't complaining, Johnny. Just making what they call an observation." His belly full, John grabbed his wide-brimmed hunting hat, lead pouch, hunting bag, and powder horn and headed out the door of the cabin. His older brother James was sitting beside the door, carefully sawing thin wafers off of a deer antler to make buttons for his new buckskin breeches that he was making. He shot a glance at John. "Johnny, don't you make me late for service." Promise I won't, he shouted over his shoulder. I'm just going to fetch a few squirrels for supper down in the old hickory hole. I'll be back in an hour or so. Just make sure you are. I'd best not have to come and fetch you, or them squirrels won't be the only things getting skint this morning. So off he traipsed into the woods in search of a tasty supper. A half hour later, he had 4 squirrels in his soft buckskin hunting bag. 2 of them dropped with one shot. He would have all kinds of fun telling that story later in church. Yes, there could be no doubt. Sundays were always the best of days. But it was on Sundays, as glorious as they were, that John missed his papa the most. He missed seeing him placed in that enormous King James Bible in the seat of the wagon behind him for the ride to the meeting house. And if he was feeling particularly rowdy or engaged in one of his all too common theological tiffs with a fellow deacon, he might also tote his Westminster Confession of Faith. John missed him sitting by the fireplace on Sunday night, reading Ambrose's Prima Media et Ultima, or Russell's 7 Sermons. He remembered fondly how his papa always seemed to smile and never ever uttered a harsh word to anyone. John ran his fingers along the heavy steel barrel of his father's Fowler, custom made by Martin Fry back in York County, Pennsylvania. It was one of the few things that he owned that had belonged to his papa. He took off his straw hat and laid it on the ground beside him, leaned his head back against the hickory tree that he was squatting beside, and then he closed his eyes. He tried to picture his papa's face and remember his voice, but it was becoming more and more difficult. Beyond his Sunday memories, there wasn't much that John could recall about his father. He had some tiny remembrances, cutting logs for the cabin, fishing in Cottle Creek, and sitting in his papa's lap to read in his horn book. His father had been gone for so long, and those memories were now distant and faded. It was hard to believe that it had been 8 years now. John had only been 7 years old when his father died. It had been a really warm spell back in February of 1772. About 2 years after Hugh Hamilton had led his family out of York County southward through the Shenandoah Valley and the dense woodlands of central Virginia and North Carolina to eventually settle on the frontier county of Mecklenburg. The local men had taken advantage of the abnormally mild weather to help a local neighbor, Ephraim Farr, get a new roof on his wind-damaged barn. That day, Hugh took a nasty fall off of a rather rickety ladder. One of his neighbors had volunteered to walk home with him, but about a quarter mile from the cabin, Hugh insisted that the neighbor turn back so that he wouldn't be caught out in the woods at night with the Cherokees making as much trouble as they were known to do. But Hugh Hamilton never made it home. The next morning, another neighbor, Thomas Bottoms, found him dead beside a spring not 100 yards from where his escort had left him that evening before. They buried Hugh Hamilton on a small rise near the Rocky River, about a quarter mile from his cabin home. It seemed like the entire community turned out to pay their respects to this godly, honest man. And for the people of Mecklenburg County, most of whom were a wicked, filthy backwoods bunch, Hugh Hamilton had been a man of some means. Unlike his barefoot, illiterate neighbors, he owned 190 acres of land. He had several horses and cows. He even owned his own wagon, only one of a handful in the entire region, and a major investment. His wardrobe sported a French jackcoat, several stylish waistcoats, and he even had a beautiful dark blue greatcoat, something unheard of for most men in the area. There was also a rumor that he was sitting on a sum of Spanish silver and French gold when he died. So it came as no surprise that the newly widowed Margaret Hamilton, a beautiful young woman of 29 years, rapidly became the object of affection of several eligible battlers along the Rocky River, All were eager to marry into the property and farm of Hugh Hamilton, especially since it was a spread that came with 4 growing boys to serve as current and future farmhands. But it was the widower, Ephraim Farr, owner of the barn and the ladder, that had killed Hugh Hamilton, who won the prize. He courted the hardest. He was an old friend of the family, having traveled south from Pennsylvania with the Hamiltons shortly after the death of his first wife. And to top it all off and to really close the deal, he paid off the outstanding mortgage on 190 acres of Hugh Hamilton's land. Since the North Carolina frontier was no place for a woman on her own with 4 small boys, and she was somewhat beholden to his generosity, she rapidly consented to a marriage. She moved her 4 boys to the Farr farm, already occupied by Ephraim's daughter and 3 sons by his first wife. And 11 months later, Margaret gave birth to her first little Farr, and she had been steadily birthing Farrs ever since. It didn't take long for James and John, the older of the Hamilton boys, to figure out that they were going to be sucking hind tit at the Farr homestead. While their mama and baby Hugh moved into the cabin with all of the rest of the Farrs, James, John, and William had to sleep in Ephraim's old cave house. It was his original dwelling on his land after he had moved to North Carolina. Basically, a log room built into the front of a small cave on a hillside along Cottle Creek. He and his kids only lived there for the first 6 months or so after settling in to the North Carolina woods while he worked on his new cabin. Since then, it had served as his root cellar and a storage place for salt and other supplies. So, James, John, and William Hamilton threw down their pallets right there amongst the beets and taters and made do as best they could. The cave was cold. The mud fireplace in the log addition drew pretty poorly, and the joint between the rock face and the timber leaked something fierce, but the boys made the very best of their new home. They raked huge piles of dry leaves from the surrounding forest and hauled them in to cover the rock floor of the cave where they slept. They made a layer that was every bit of 1 foot deep. Their stepfather was at least cordial enough to give them a huge plush black bear hide to place atop their leaf pile mattress. About a week after they moved in, James shot another bear, which ensured the boys a thick winter bear blanket, something that they would need in a few months. The Hamilton boys took most of their meals outside on the porch or under the trees, either alone or with Mr. Farr's occasional hired hands. There were only rare occasions when they were actually allowed inside the family cabin. In general, they weren't welcome there. Farr didn't want them there. It broke their mother's heart, of course, but she always made sure that the boys were well fed and clothed, and they worked hard on the Farr farm, as hard as boys of age 12, 9, and 6 could work. And their mother saw to it that they received some book learning, but they were, for all practical purposes, pretty much on their own and raising themselves. Such was their existence for 6 years until early last year when James had turned 18 years old. He went to Ephraim and demanded some of the land of his father for his own. He wanted off of the Farr farm, and he was taking his brothers John and William with him. First came a flood of their mother's tears, and then her feminine wiles kicked in. She bargained, pleaded, manipulated, and cajoled her husband, generally making life unbearable for the man and unbelievable in a blustery storm of female emotion until he relented and at last agreed to give the boys their father's land, but for a price. On January 30th, 1779, he mortgaged Hugh Hamilton's original 190 acres to James, John, and William Hamilton for the hefty price of 100 Spanish milled dollars, to be paid back at a rate of 50 cents per month over 20 years. It was an enormous sum of money for 3 boys aged 18, 15, especially with the war with King George going on. But they took the offer, anything to get off of the Farr farm. Now, amazingly, the boys were actually making a go of it. They moved their meager belongings back into the cabin that their father had built for them, and at last they were back home. They grew a decent crop of corn their first season. They sold furs and they brain tanned deer hides for a trader who came through Charlotte every couple of months. James and John hired themselves out a couple of times for odd jobs on nearby farms to earn a little extra money. Their mama pitched in too, skimming a little flour and sugar and coffee from the Farr family supplies and gifting it to her boys. It helped that their stepfather was often hurting for a little extra labor as well. He had begun to dig and purify salt from a lick on his farm, and the local commissioner of Mecklenburg County had contracted with him to provide salt for the militia as well as shipment to the Continental Army, and it was hard work, but it paid well. Not in cash to the Hamilton boys, of course, but in forgiveness of their monthly debt payment. So the boys, on several occasions, were able to trade a few days of labor for their monthly payment on the farmland. Thus far, the salt operation and the sale of corn were the only connections that the Hamilton boys had to the war. The local militia, of which James was a part, met and drilled about once a month. John also attended muster whenever James would let him. They occasionally fielded patrols to keep an eye out for Tory activity, but there wasn't much of that going on in Mecklenburg County. Ever since the Mecklenburg Resolves in 1775, the county had been a hotbed of independence and patriot sentiment, a so-called hornet's nest. And the local residents lived up to their stinging moniker. The Presbyterians of Mecklenburg County were more than happy to cast off the yoke of King George and the Church of England. It galled them that they had to hire one of the king's vicars in order to have what the British would consider a legal marriage. But politics, kings, and wars on this beautiful Sunday might as well have been a million miles away. Yes, General Clinton had invaded South Carolina by sea and put Charlestown under siege last month, but up until now, the whole official war had basically been up in the north. And surely it would not come to sleepy little Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Local folk were more concerned about wandering bands of renegade Cherokees or the occasional Creek Indian hunting parties than they were about Tories or redcoats. John, awash with memories and lulled by the comfort of the warm May morning, was just on the verge of dozing off against that tree when he heard a limb suddenly crash to his left. It was the den of a careless squirrel jumping from one tree to another. John scanned until he caught a glimpse of the little critter, cocked his fowler, and then aimed about a foot in front of it as it ran down the limb toward the trunk of a hickory tree. The loud report of the gun and a cloud of white smoke were followed by the dull thud of a lifeless squirrel hitting the hillside. 5 squirrels would make a fine supper for him and his brothers. Smiling with satisfaction, he scooped up the squirrel by the tail as he trudged up the hill toward the cabin. He knew that he barely had enough time to clean all 5 of the critters and get them soaking in salt water before leaving for church. I'll tell you what, it's a good stopping point. We'll break right there. It's kind of the first half of chapter 1. So come back, tune in next time, and we will pick right up with chapter 2. So come back and read some more with me of Brothers and Warriors, Book 1 of the Patriots of the American Revolution series.